So I'm going to try this again. I started lecturing and then we had a little bit of a situation. There we go. Okay, I can delete this one. We had a situation where my internet went a little screwy, and now the old one is deleted, and hopefully you are seeing me now. All right, so let's hope I can get this stream in before the rain makes my internet all wonky. Hello, welcome to the 8th lecture in Kent State University's Games for Education course. So today we're going to look at transformational games from another angle and see how they use their rhetorical powers as a way to be subversive, and how that creates opportunities in the industry for small creators to get attention, for representation, and really kind of explore a phenomena in the industry. Rather, today's kind of a switch where we're exploring like a social element of the industry that the kind of game design that we've been playing around with allows, as opposed to kind of hammering in on some of the game production stuff like we have the past few weeks. So first of all, what do we mean by subversive? That's one of the topics today. We're going to talk about examples of subversive games. We're going to talk about games as cultural resistance from the context of a textbook that I actually use for the game prototyping class, which is called Rules of Play: Game Design Fundamentals. So they talk about games as cultural resistance in like a big portion of the book. We're going to talk about why somebody might make subversive games. And we're going to talk about our case study today is Republia Times by Lucas Pope. And to give you some background, in around 2004, you saw a kind of revolutionary moment in the game industry, which was the birth of Steam, or the release of Steam. Now, before that, in order to get your game to people, you had to have a relationship with the publisher, have that publisher put your game in a box and make cartridges or CDs or something like that, and then actually have it like distributed to retail stores like Walmart or Target or Best Buy or GameStop or something like that. But what eventually happened with Steam, it started as a thing where you would have to like download it to get Half-Life 2 if you bought Half-Life 2, but it eventually became a marketplace. Now, this is also around the time where you start having these sites like Congregate and Newgrounds, where people are making and launching not only animation but Flash games, and those platforms eventually evolved into like HTML5 platforms. But from Steam and things like that, you got Xbox Live Arcade and WiiWare, and which eventually became the Nintendo eShop and the PlayStation Store. You also, eventually got the App Store. That's how I got my start in the industry as a commercial game developer, was developing mobile games, because that was a very indie-friendly platform to be on. So, the norm went from places where independent developers were there really weren't an indie scene. There was not an indie scene because you couldn't really put your games out anywhere, to being able to distribute games on your own. Now that created a lot of inventive commercial games, but it also, in the late 2000s, we started to see a lot of instances where engines started to become more accessible. So where, before game development was something that was very, you had to know computer science, you had to know C++, it was kind of, cordoned off, with Flash being what it was when it got ActionScript, and also with things like Game Maker and eventually Unity, and when Unreal became more kind of like user-friendly and things like that. And then especially with like things like Twine, really accessible, engines, or Bitsy, or these like smaller, really tiny engines. You're starting to see things where game development becomes more accessible. And likewise, once platforms like GameJolt and Itch come along, which are Steam-like marketplaces, but existing on the web like a Newgrounds, and anybody can just like freely post their content, you start to see this rich system of people being very experimental with their games rather than purely commercial. So that's what we're going to talk about. So first of all, let's talk about how games can subvert societal ideas or even the gaming medium themselves. So we reviewed, we weren't able to play because of the death of Flash, but if you remember our first case study game, September 12th, it was a game that acted both as an interactive experience and, as the New York Times called it, a political cartoon. It used the so-called rhetoric of failure to build meaning. The game subverted your expectation that you could win to make a rhetorical argument about war in the Middle East. A more recent game is Black Room by Cassie McQuater. It's an IGF Nuovo award-winning browser-based game playable on itch.io. It reuses assets from famous 8 and 16-bit games to create these sort of like surreal dreamscapes. You also occasionally return to the Black Room, where the game uses the affordances of web browsers to deliver content by opening and closing windows. So like as you open and close windows, you are exploring the room, because like if you expand the room, you see more of the room. If you move the window around, you look around the room, things like that. So you'll do things like play videos, you'll do Google searches within the room, making you'll resize the room even to like reveal hidden objects. So you explore this room, and then once you solve these puzzles, you are taken to a sort of like dream world. But what happens is the developer reuses characters. I'm going to switch over here so that you can see the attributions. So you use characters from previous games. So the previous one, the protagonist of that scene was the protagonist from a game called Clock Tower, a Japanese-only Super Nintendo horror game. And she was in a town from Castlevania Rondo of Blood, or, if you prefer, Dracula X Chino Rondo. So it's mishmashing these things together, where you take that character from Clock Tower and her role in the story, not only as protagonist, but she's a protagonist in the sort of like final girl sense of a horror movie, where there is the like woman who is the last woman of she is kind of like pursued and stalked by a malevolent character, in this case a creepy serial killer with like giant scissors, but she is the trope of like the final girl, which is like the final female protagonist character who is pursued and ultimately like escapes from the slasher in the slasher film. But likewise in this scene you have characters from different fighting games, like what's her name? Lilith is one of them. Characters from like the Darkstalkers series and things like that, where you have these basically sexy fighting game characters. It's reinterpreting these characters and reusing them in such a way where they are taken out of that sort of context, in the way that they are used in often like very male-dominated game development and game playing environments, to kind of like subvert their usual representation in games. So that's what the game does, is it kind of uses these reappropriated assets to question how female characters are viewed and seen in games. So in that way, it has like really strong feminist themes. So from this, we can see that one way games become subversive is by using game mechanics or game tropes or game art assets in ways that are not expected, like not being able to win in September 12th, or taking typically, you know, female characters that are meant to be sort of ogled and taking them out of that kind of visual context in Black Room. Or if you've ever played, favorite of mine, both professionally and gameplay-wise, the Stanley Parable. And then, like, the Beginner's Guide, I know does a lot. The sort of spiritual successor to Stanley Parable, the Beginner's Guide does this a lot too. The Stanley Parable, what it does is it uses the tropes of video games in such a way that you are guided in very typical ways through a video game environment. But what it does is it puts the least interesting content in that main golden path, shall we call it. So golden path is a level design idea where it depends on who you talk to. Some people say golden path is the most efficient way through the level. Some people say the golden path is the path that, I've seen it used both ways. The golden path is like the path that you are explicitly expecting the player to go on. Some people just call that the main path. But regardless, this sort of golden path is actually the least interesting. By not listening to the game, not only the narrator's prompts, but also just sort of like the way level design works, you know, by getting off of that path, you find the best and most interesting and inventive stuff. So that's one way the Stanley Parable kind of makes you question the tropes of game and level design. Another way to play with this idea is to use familiar game elements in new ways, such as game characters, levels, music, or other things that are not usually seen. You see this a little bit in Black Room, but you also might see it in a game like 2015's Default Dan. So it reverses the meaning of many game objects found in the Mario series, where coins are usually helpful. In this case, they kill you, whereas traditional hazards help you. Now, this one is a little blunt, but you can see how this sort of novelty can be very interesting to create a typical game with, and see how many times people maybe like screw it up. Like see how many times a typical player is perhaps going to revert to kind of a reflex when they go for the coin and then remember really quickly, oh wait, I'm actually supposed to be avoiding coins this time. Coins mean bad in this game. So it's playing around with the idea that, symbols in games, artwork, come to represent different kind of game mechanics. So another one, though, is how using entire game platforms in unexpected ways. So in this artwork, Super Mario Clouds by Cory Archangel. Now, Cory Archangel is a interactive artist who uses video games, classic video games especially, in a lot of different subversive ways. So with Super Mario Clouds, he actually hacks a copy of Super Mario Brothers for the NES and makes it so that you can just see clouds sort of roll by. So it's, actually hacking the source material. Additionally, he had a game called I Shot, oh my gosh, why can't I remember the name of the artist? His game purports to shoot. Let's see, Campbell's. Andy Warhol. I Shot Andy Warhol. But it's taking this sort of, idea of this gameplay experience, but putting you in the real life shoes of an assassin, a real world assassin. So works like this have been shown at major art museums, and show how you can use game. I guess the medium of playing a game as a subversive device and a contemporary art device itself. Bounden is a mobile game from 2014. So similar to how Cory Archangel is taking the material of game playing, the NES itself and the cartridge, and sort of subverting it to create this like pleasant blue sky, Bounden takes the way in which people hold their phones and turns it into a medium for having people dance. So Bounden is a mobile game in which two players must keep their hands on a phone screen together as it directs them to position themselves in different ways. The result is that the players actually perform dances with one another. So I mentioned this element of rules of play, the textbook from game prototyping, having a chapter called Games as Cultural Resistance. And I think that's kind of worth discussing. I think it's a really good, it's from 2004. So what is in there is fairly out of date, but I think it talks about this idea that this was sort of a thing that's always been of games. It's not that games necessarily, Steam came along and suddenly people had these ideas. This was something that was alive in games, that this accessibility of both launching games but also making games has sort of allowed to rise to the surface and become like a real force in the industry. So at that time, what people were thinking about in terms of subversive games would not have been commercial releases, but instead they would be things like mods. So mods, and by extension the mod scene, were when you would take the material of games and commercial games and modify them in such a way that awful moments in human history. So it just told me that I disconnected. So let me take another look at my YouTube and see what state that video was in. Because if it stopped, if I'm still going, I'm just going to keep going. Okay. Let's see. Let's see what happens here. It says that I'm still live. Sorry if there's any dead air here, but we're having some internet connectivity issues today. So I may be having to start a new video as a part 2. All right. It does say that I'm still... Oh, wait. Okay, I think I'm still live. Hooray. Because there's me looking at my phone on the video. Great. Sorry about that. I really dislike it when the internet gets kind of weird. Okay, so my game, Lazinski's Revenge, has elements like this. As a game based on a propaganda poster, the game uses strong visual messaging in the beginning of the game to teach players how to play it. So as players interact with the 25 levels of the game, they begin to uncover messages contradicting the tutorials of the game itself, and propose these contradictory messages propose the idea that rather than having the role of a hero, you are in fact an evil aggressor. The final set of levels introduces yellow squares that kill red characters, including your own character, which is the red wedge. And leading your compatriots to them is required for finishing levels. So along the way, you meet these other red shapes that you have to move into position in order for them to help you solve puzzles. So in the final set of levels, you actually have to move them into the yellow shapes, which kill red shapes. And those yellow shapes, so essentially you have to sacrifice them for your cause of, which in the game is beating the white circle. So the final level gives you a choice. You must either kill your character a bunch of times by driving it into the yellow square in order to uncover the hiding spot of the white circle and eliminate it, or you can leave and just walk away. So in this way, the game questions the propagandic nature of games. Should you blindly listen to the directions that games or similarly propaganda give you, or should you check the veracity and truth of messages in games? So why should you make games like this? I'm just going to check the thing again. Okay, so we're still on. Good. So why should you make games like this? Games with subversive elements share elements with contemporary and postmodern art. Postmodernism has a distrust of grand theories and itself questions many normal elements of a genre. It often does this by reusing familiar pieces in the way that the Black Room reused familiar game sprites in new ways. Such games are popular entries not only in commercial-focused game festivals like the IGF or Indiecade, but also in art exhibition-driven ones like the Sam Arcade, or the Akron Game Fest that we've been doing with Akron Art Museum. But you also see it at places like the Serious Play convention, Games for Change in New York, or Meaningful Play, which at the time of this recording was just last week, and there were lots of really cool games that played with some of these ideas there. It's a way to extend our understanding of what games can be and to find crossovers with other forms of art. The accessibility of game engines has created a renaissance of also representational opportunities. For example, about 10 years ago, the text-based Twine engine really exploded because its accessibility allowed creators from underrepresented groups to express themselves with artistically meaningful small games. Thanks to its ease of use and the ability, the other thing that was important about this, it was easy to use. It didn't require a lot of production and assets to publish a game with. You didn't have to also then make 3D models and do all the things you have to do. And if you were trying to make a immersive simulator or something like that, you could make a tiny text-based adventure that you could play for a few minutes. And you could also launch it to the web, which was incredibly important as a means of distributing these games widely without the need of a publisher or to deal with things like I talked about the ease of use of Steam before, but relative to other platforms, Steam is actually kind of a pain in the neck to get on. It also costs like $100 to put your game on, which in the grand scheme of things is not much considering publishing costs of games, but for somebody without a lot of resources, that can actually be a barrier to entry as opposed to a place like Itch that you can post a Twine game to for free. But we're also seeing a similar adoption of the GB Studio engine, which has many of the same features, including, easy to learn, easy to use, web-based launching, in addition to launching on the Game Boy platform, if you have access to a cartridge flasher, or, you can distribute your game as a ROM for emulators. But you see, it's very simple. It's much simpler to make a Game Boy game with 4 colors, even though now you're adding visual elements. It's 16 by 16 sprites and 4 shades of green are much easier to manage than having to do again, very flashy and detailed pixel art if you're trying to create something small and more intimate. So the Eurevania series, for example, asks what would happen if you could wander Dracula's castle in Castlevania games and get to know or even date the castle's denizens. So that's by Paige Ashlyn. And one thing that I think is really interesting about this GB Studio engine in particular is that, all right, so let's see, it keeps telling me